EWTN's The Journey Home.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Welcome to EWTN News presents the Synod on Synodality in Rome. I'm Catherine Hadro. The last of the two assemblies for the Synod on Synodality is entering its final stretch this week in Rome before officially concluding on Sunday. The delegates focus this week to write, amend, and vote on the Synod's final document. This document will contain the Synod's ideas and recommendations for the Church and will be delivered to Pope Francis, who can either adopt and publish the document as an official text, or the Holy Father can use it as a guide for his own document. Here joining me throughout this week in Rome are my two co-hosts. Dr. Matthew Bunson is the Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News, and Father Thomas Petri is President of the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, great to be with you. This Synod has been going on for 3 weeks now. We're here for its final week. Matthew, we were here last October as well.
We were.
Give us a quick rundown of what to expect this week.
Well, as you noted, that this is the second of the two sessions. It started last October. But in many ways, you said 3 weeks. This is actually a process of 3 years. We go back to 2021 when Pope Francis really began this global synodal process that then led to the session last year and is now leading to this one. What we can expect this week is the wrap-up. We've had deliberations now for 3 weeks. We'll talk more about that certainly over today and over the next few days. But this week they're anticipating receiving the draft final report, which is a synthesis of everything they've been discussing for the last 3 weeks. As you noted too, they will make amendments. Last year there were a lot of amendments. We expect perhaps not as many fireworks this year, but expect quite a few amendments. They'll then vote on it. It'll be presented. Also this week, it was just announced today that Pope Francis will be promulgating, releasing a new encyclical, Dilexit Nos. He loved us. And it's a reflection, which he kind of tipped a few months ago on the Sacred Heart. So a lot of news happening in this final week.
That will be happening on Thursday, so of
Yes,
course
it
we'll
will.
be covering that as well. A lot to report on this entire week. I'm glad that we're here together. And as you said, this month marks the second General Assembly for the Synod on Synodality. The first happened last October. Here's a look back now on what already took place at the Vatican to set the stage for this year.
Ho stabilito che questa assemblea sinodale si svolgerà in 2 sessioni.
The Synod on Synodality, a journey that began with Pope Francis's vision for a more listening church, reached a significant milestone a year ago with the first gathering in Rome. Announced in May of 2021 and extended in 2022, the Synod is set to conclude at the end of the month with the final report submitted next summer. The first month-long gathering brought together 365 participants from around the world, culminating in a report that summarized the deliberations over the weeks and incorporated more than 1,150 proposed amendments to the text. Approved by all 344 voting members with the required two-thirds majority, the 42-page document covered significant topics, including life and mission of the Church, including decision-making, a greater role for women in the Church, although on the controversial issue of women deacons, they recommended further study, more accountability of bishops when it comes to finances, new ministries for the laity, such as a ministry to assist married couples and those preparing for marriage, gatherings of church leaders to make synodality a permanent part of life at every level of the Church. Another notable feature of the Synod on Synodality was the first ever voting participation of the lay people in the deliberations.
Thank you for having me here.
One of the participants spoke about that during our live coverage from the Vatican.
It was February 2023 that we were there in El Salvador, and then May I received this letter. Like, you're on a short list. We're going to send a list of 20 people to the Holy Father, and he's going to choose 10 non-bishops to represent Latin America.
Some of the hot-button issues that were talked about throughout the month were not addressed directly in the report. For example, while there was no use of the term LGBT in the document, closeness and support for those who experience loneliness as a result of being faithful to the teachings of the Church on sexuality was expressed. There was also no mention of blessing of same-sex couples.
Let's not pin everything on the Holy Spirit.
Archbishop Anthony Fisher from Sydney, Australia, spoke exclusively to EWTN News during the 2023 Synod, regretting the time spent on issues other than bringing people back to the faith.
The big issue for the church today, particularly in the cultures I know, the Western world, where we've got the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, the ones that say they have no faith. When there's a census, they write no religion, or just tick the no religion box. And that's going up and up and up, particularly amongst young people. You're looking at, in many populations now, half the young people are saying that they have no religion, even more.
In the press briefing on the final day, Cardinal Mario Grech, the General Secretary of the Synod, expressed his gratitude for how the participants were open to listening and finding consensus. Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, the Synod's Relator General, said that when some of the more amended controversial topics came up for vote, including increasing the role of women in the Church, there were not as many voting against it as he would have thought.
I think it was clear that some topics would meet greater opposition. I am full of wonder that so many people have voted in favor. So that means that the resistance are not so great as people have thought before. So I am happy with that result.
The first session of the two-part synod ended with Mass celebrated by Pope Francis in St. Peter's Basilica.
Today, we do not see the full fruit of this process, but with foresight, we can look at the horizon that opens before us. The Lord will guide us and help us to be a more synodal and more missionary church, worshiping God and serving the women and men of our time, going out to bring the consoling joy of the gospel to all.
This October, Synod participants have reconvened inside the Vatican to conclude the work begun last year and to provide new and concrete proposals for the future of the Universal Church.
That was a great recap, a great refresher from last October. And it's been said so far this October, it's been more tame. Is that a fair assessment? Bring us up to speed with the 3 weeks.
Exactly. So they began with the opening Mass, obviously, but just before that, they had a retreat like they did last year. They also had a somewhat unique penitential service in which they searingly honest assessment of where we might be failing as Christians and as a church. Then we had basically working through the Instrumentum Laboris, the blueprint for the Synod. And it was in 3 main categories of relationships, of people, and places. And that's where, in many ways, we could see the work of this first Synod playing out because they picked up on many of those themes. But also, and this is one of the keys to understanding what's happening here, is that Pope Francis changed things a little bit. He ordered that the focus of this synod, this gathering this year, be on synodality in the life of the church. The hot-button issues, as we're going to hear a lot more this week about, 10 study groups looking at these controversial questions. So this one is a much more tightly focused, and I think we're going to see that in the report that's coming up.
And those study groups continue on past October.
They do. They go until June of next year, and we'll have to see how all of that comes together.
Exactly. And of course, throughout this week, Father, we're going to be putting this specific synod into context of the life of the church. There are some important themes that are cropping up throughout this synod on synodality that I think you can really put into proper context for us.
Well, I think as we've seen so many of the synods during Pope Francis's pontificate, I think we've seen 2 basic movements competing against each other. One is one I think we're all familiar with, a certain cadre of clerics and theologians who want to use Pope Francis's words to push change in the church, change in practice, and even sometimes change in doctrine. But when the Holy Father speaks, and there's this other side of the synodality, is really looking more at listening to other parts of the church, the experience of other parts of the church, and being a little bit more focused on how to evangelize the world. This division goes back all the way to the Second Vatican Council. Not long after the council ended, the theologians, the parity of the council, who really were influential, people like Joseph Ratzinger, people like Henri de Lubac, Karl Rahner, Hans Kung, Edward Schillebeck, they had a sort of division between them into the 70s, and a group of them formed what became known as the Concilium Journal. And Concilium means exactly what it sounds like, council. This would be Karl Rahner, Hans Kung, Schillebeck. And what they thought was that the council didn't go far enough, and that it was such a great experience that it would be wonderful if we could just continue to live the council perpetually. And so they named their journal the Concilium. Joseph Ratzinger, Karol Wojtyła, Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar didn't agree with that vision. They saw the church more primarily as communio and not concilium. And of course, they founded the Communio Journal. And they said that the church can't be perpetually involved in a council because then it's all looking into itself. It turns inward. Whereas the church as communio, divinely instituted by God, is meant to evangelize the world. And I think that same tension is being played out. We just heard Archbishop Fisher in that interview from last year note that so many of the issues that seem to be getting focused on during these synods and taking up media time and synod time have been issues other than like evangelization. Like, what are we saying about the nones and the people who have left the faith and how to bring them back?
Yeah, and this is a drama in many ways that has been playing out since the council, as you noted. One of the other ways that it has played out is this idea of hermeneutics. In other words, what are sort of the interpretive tools that we use, especially in assessing and implementing the council? We can never criticize the council or the documents of the council because it is an ecumenical council, but how some interpreted it is very important as we move forward, as we have seen over this last 60 years. So there's been this two competing hermeneutics, and it reflects in many ways the communio and concilium dynamic, and that is there a hermeneutic, is there a lens in which we look at the council as rupture, as severing everything from the past? If that's the case, then everything's on the table, we can change what we want under the guise of inspiration and innovation and progress, or is there, as John Paul II was always stressing, and certainly Pope Benedict XVI and Joseph Ratzinger prior to his election as Benedict XVI stressed, no, it is a hermeneutic, an interpretive lens of reform and continuity. And so we see that playing out even here.
And this drama, it's important to note that this drama has been playing out for the last 60 years in priestly formation in various seminaries, not only in the United States, but certainly around Europe. And in some ways, it's still being played out in seminaries and priestly formation in places like Europe. And so the reason this drama stays alive is because a couple of generations of priests who are now bishops and cardinals are living out one side or another of the Concilium Communio drama of interpreting Vatican II.
And is this the lens that we approach this week, keeping our eye out for these competing ideologies? Because I think for the everyday Catholic, they're not even really aware of what's going on here in Rome and at the Vatican. And so many people, this has been a 3-year process. What is synodality? The everyday Catholic is not aware.
Well, the fact that we're still trying to provide a comprehensive definition to synodality, this isn't a criticism at all of Pope Francis, who has been very clear from the beginning. And I think, to your point, we have to listen to what Pope Francis has said and what Pope Francis wants. And I know that we were just in Ecuador, and you had a remarkable experience.
Well, I think the International Eucharistic Congress that we had the privilege of covering in Quito, Ecuador, really also sort of focused on synodality, but in a way that's different than what the narrative has been about the synodality. heretofore, which is to say all the talks and all the witnesses at the International Eucharistic Congress in Quito really focus on what I came to call sort of the horizontal notion that it's not just that the Eucharist and Mass is not just about my relationship with God, but also making us a community in relationship with God that then goes out. And this is not just a Vatican II doctrine. This goes back all the way to at least someone like Pope Pius XII and his encyclical Mediator Dei, in which he was concerned that the faithful during Mass, and this would have been the Tridentine Mass, the Tridentine Rite, had become too oriented on their own personal relationship with Christ, even though that still remains primary, and they weren't taking the fruits of that sacramental grace to engage in the works of mercy, the corporal works of mercy, the spiritual works of mercy, going out of the church to bring the people of God, to bring the faithful and to convert the unfaithful.
Right, and we can see in, especially what Pope Francis wants, two things that are very active. The first is Catholic social teaching, which of course it's the Magna Carta, as it's called in Rerum Novarum under Pope Leo XIII in 1891. But with Francis, too, he also stresses, and has stressed really from the night that we saw him come out onto the loggia here at St. Peter's Basilica, is the idea of the peripheries, the periferia, of going out.
Right.
Remembering, though, that is geographical, certainly around the world. We've seen that the way he has chosen cardinals and places he's visited, these far-flung corners of the world. But he's also talking about the peripheries, those who are forgotten, those who are overlooked, those who are suffering spiritually. There are two types of poor that he always references. There are those who are financially poor, who are suffering under systems, but then there are also the spiritually poor, who can be around us in our own families and may include many of us as the poor who need to be reached.
When it comes to synodality, it means that journeying together, that coming together. And we're seeing that reflected even just how the delegates are meeting. They're meeting in round tables. I think they're changing groups. It's this chance for the global church to come together. But this synod, and you both have covered other previous synods here in Rome, this synod is unique in the sense that typically synods are a synod of bishops, but here there are lay people. Can you kind of explain what sets this synod apart?
Well, obviously that's one thing, that it's not just the bishops voting. But I do think, and this has been to the consternation of many delegates who want to see doctrinal change, for example, on women deacons or decentralization of doctrinal authority, is that the good of synodality is this very active listening to hear the experience of Catholics, and these are faithful, practicing Catholics, and the experience of what the church is like in their part of the world and who the vulnerable are. And that, takes me back once again to Quito. It was a very moving experience for me, is not simply because it was focused on the Eucharist, but it was clearly focused, as International Eucharistic Congresses are, because they travel the world every 4 years. It was clearly focused on the experience of the church and the people of South America, which is obviously very different. A lot of very different issues that we in the United States don't face.
Right. And at that International Eucharistic Congress, we were given that opportunity to see Latin America. But by nature of an International Eucharistic Congress, people from all over the world. So we heard the testimony from Ukraine, for example. One of the most horrifying moments was from one of the Ukrainian bishops who had a very lengthy discussion about what's happening in Ukraine, the devastation of churches. But then he brought it back to the Eucharist and hope. Pope Francis is going to be releasing another autobiography soon, and the title of it is simply Hope. And I think that's one of the things that Pope Francis is trying to get at in synodality, is that there are so many people around the world who do not have hope. But he also recognizes that as a church, we need to be listening. The very term synod, synhodos, of journeying together. And I think that's, to go back to your question, why are there so many lay people here?
Right.
Why are there? Because he's broadening out that listening capacity for the church. And it comes with risks, that there are those who are trying to push for changes. But let's, as I said, stay with what Francis has asked us to do.
And on a practical note, I mean, there are parents who are here, who have children back at home. I think some are bringing their children with them for this month in Rome. But that's a legitimate challenge and burden for a lot of those delegates. Another aspect that makes this synod unique is that they're not speaking to the media. So we in the media, we're a bit limited in our knowledge of what discussions are happening, what are the developments. We can know from press briefings. But Matthew, is there anything that we do know about any pushback happening within the Synod, particularly from last year?
Well, last year we knew that there was quite a bit of pushback within the halls. They eventually were speaking about it fairly openly on the issue, one of those hot button issues, I think, especially of women deacons, ordination of women to the priesthood. That was significant at the time. This year, we know that there has been, because a number of people have spoken openly about it, some pushback against, as they have explored the question of authority in the church, and also the question of the role of Episcopal conferences. What power do they have? Should they be given expanded authority, for example, to weigh in or to change doctrine, faith, and morals in their given country? So what is that relationship then? And there was, we know, quite a bit of pushback within the Synod Hall on that issue. And it's one that you just raised because it's fundamental in many ways to the question of synodality as it's being addressed here in the Synod.
Well, and I think this is going to be something that we need to keep an eye on over this coming week in our coverage. That, like you said, when you listen to what Pope Francis actually says, synodality is not about parliamentary procedure. This is not about voting on what we believe and what we should do. It is very much about listening. So often you hear people ask, well, what's going to come from all of this?
Right.
I'm not sure much, but the wonderful experience of people listening to each other and having a greater awareness of the universal church, which the church has accomplished by different means over its history, not just the International Eucharistic Congresses, but World Youth Days, when you have youth from all over the world coming and getting to know each other. So it seems that these synods are becoming increasingly a locus to experience the universal church, but those who really want some sort of concrete change or concrete outcome, I think, have been frustrated at every synod that's happened under the pontificate.
And I think just putting this, again, into context for our viewers and our listeners, it's not that the group of delegates here have the capacity to change church teaching, for example. Ultimately, they are working on a final document, which will go to Pope Francis.
Well, and two things to note in that. The first is that you're absolutely right. A synod does not have that authority. Any synod does not have that authority. But the other point that was made by, in fact, the head, the Secretary General of the Synod, and that's Cardinal Mario Grech, he talked about it last year, he's talked about it this year, we've heard it from a number of other bishops. I've heard it from a number of people I've talked to here in Rome, a reminder that in no way does the presence of the lay people detract or reduce the rightful place of bishops within the Synod of Bishops or the rightful place and authority of bishops in the church. And that's a point that I think has to be one of those fundamental starting points as they proceed with their discussions, especially as Pope Francis himself will be receiving this final report.
Well, it's obvious there's a lot more to discuss, as we will be doing throughout this week and throughout our coverage today. And our coverage from Rome continues right after this break.
And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, establish, and strengthen you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Amen. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 10 and 11.
Steve, what do you say when you hear this very common pro-choice argument? An embryo or fetus is just a part of a woman's body, and a woman can do whatever she wants with her own body.
Right, the classic body part argument. The embryo is in no way a part of the mother's body. Science clearly defines body part as a structure that shares the same genetic code as the rest of the body, like the appendix or a tonsil or an arm, and it does not direct its own development. The unborn child has a completely unique genetic code. Half the time, it has a different sex than its own mother, and it also directs its own development. So the embryo is clearly a separate living human being residing temporarily inside his or her mother.
That's the science of the matter.
Election night is just around the corner, and EWTN News is here to help you get ready to vote. With so much at stake, life, our families, and religious freedom, we're committed to keeping you informed on where the candidates stand. Join us Tuesday, November 5th for an election night special with extended coverage and expert analysis on the issues that matter to you. Tune in at 6 p.m. Eastern, again at 9, and the next morning at 10 for full results, only on EWTN.
We are joined now by Frank Rocca, Senior Vatican Analyst for EWTN News. He's covered the Vatican since 2007, obviously been keeping a close eye on this synod. Frank, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, you've been covering the Vatican for years now. Overall, how has this synod meeting this October compared to last October? What's the mood here in Rome?
Well, there's a feeling that there's less at stake this year because, of course, the Pope took the most controversial issues, including women's ordination, off the table and handed them over to some study groups that will finish their work next year. So, in a sense, he's kind of extended the synod into next year, in effect.
That's a good clarification.
Yeah, well, so early on, there was a bit of media frenzy about the prospect of women deacons. We know that Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, in many ways, said that that's been off the table, so to speak, at least the question as they're studying it, but it's not really off the table, as we have talked. But walk us through that and how the Synod delegates have responded.
Well, I mean, the Cardinal came out on the Pope, as we know, the background of this is that the Pope back in April told CBS News, no, women's ordination is not possible if women's deacons are not possible if it's a question of holy orders. So that seemed to have settled the issue. But then the Cardinal Fernandez, the head of the doctrinal office, came out at the first day of the Synod here, the first working day, and he said something to the effect that, well, so far our research doesn't allow that there's yet the possibility of saying yes to women's ordination. So obviously that sends the signal that maybe there is a possibility for those people who feels very strongly in favor of this. That's a signal not to give up. And in fact, there have been talks on the sidelines, formal and informal talks. There was a march by some activists and so forth. So that's kept it in the news. And then there was a bit of a kerfuffle last week when Cardinal Fernandez didn't show up at a meeting, an expected meeting. He was expected to show up at a meeting to talk about this, to talk about the work on the women deacons. And so, of course, that only inflamed interest. And so an attempt to sort of play it down has only increased curiosity, I think.
Is this something that is do you think this is I'm asking you to divine a little bit. Is this a strategy, you think, to keep different sides appeased and active in the whole process, like those who want women's ordination and those who don't? And is this why it continues to be a topic of discussion, even when it seems the Pope shuts it down?
Well, I was saying that Cardinal Fernandez is very close to the Pope, so I'm sure he's not acting on his own without the Pope's approval. So there does seem to be an ambiguity, and the Pope is known for ambiguity in many cases over the last more than decade of his reign. So yes, there may be an idea that he doesn't want people to give up, and he wants to keep people in the tent who may be more inclined that way, while at the same time not opening the door, because he's had three different bodies now that have been studying this issue. He's made it clear he's not crazy about it. If I wouldn't bet on it happening, and yet he doesn't want to absolutely say the definitive no, evidently, and perhaps that's right. Maybe he's just trying to keep them in the tent.
Frank, another aspect that has made this specific synod unique is that unlike past meetings where the quote-unquote pontifical secret only applied to sharing what was said by others in the synod hall, the Synod on Synodality's official regulations no longer allow synod delegates to share their personal interventions. Can you speak to how this has played out, how you expect it will play out this week? And I'm curious how this has affected your work as a Vatican journalist.
Well, I think last year there was a lot more friction, and sometimes it broke out into open and in the press briefings, which are supposed to be the only source of information about what goes on in the Synod Hall. And journalists would complain about this, and there was some tension about this. It seems, again, much more relaxed this year. I think part of that, again, is because these controversial issues are not supposed to be the main topic of conversation. Part of it is that perhaps people are being a little more relaxed about speaking in general off the record. Also, sometimes they have given interviews. Archbishop Anthony Fisher of Sydney gave an interview to EWTN last week, and he talked in general terms about one of his concerns being topics of decentralization. And in fact, Jonathan Liedl of the National Catholic Register reported last week, he talked to some people who were in the Synod Hall during what sounds like a contentious conversation about that very issue.
Yeah, on that very issue, what exactly is at stake here with that very question of decentralization and authority in the Church?
Well, Pope Francis, from almost the beginning of his reign, in Evangelii Gaudium, which was his agenda-setting document in 2013, the first year of his reign, said that he wanted more decentralization, specifically to genuine doctrinal authority for bishops' conferences, which is a sensitive point. Pope John Paul in the late 90s had said that bishops' conferences can only pronounce on doctrine when they're unanimous. But the Pope seems to want more than that. In fact, he said he wants more than that because he said that the promise of the Second Vatican Council in this regard has not yet been fulfilled. The concern of others is that this could lead to fragmentation, right? And we see in some churches, other churches, Christian churches, United Methodist Church, the Episcopal, the Anglican Communion, there has been real fragmentation because of disagreements about church teaching, and we see that happening to some extent. With the question of homosexuality, the same-sex blessings, Fiducia Supplicans, which the Vatican released late last year, allows for same-sex blessings, but the African bishops en masse rejected that, and the Pope said, okay, that's fine, it doesn't apply in Africa. So we already see that happening. The worry of some people is that it could lead to fragmentation.
The Holy Father announced during this Synod consistory to create 21 new cardinals, and quite a few of them are actually here at the Synod as delegates. Any names in that list that we should know about or keep an eye on that our viewers might be interested in?
Well, I find particularly interesting the former Grand Master of your religious order, Father Timothy Radcliffe, who is, it's unusual, he's a theologian, a very prominent theologian. Usually such people are made honorary cardinals after the age of 80, but he won't be 80 until August of next year, which means that if there's a conclave in the meantime, he'll be a cardinal elector, which is unusual. He's an interesting figure, I think, obviously for people in the English-speaking world. He's seen, as you know, by many people as kind of a progressive voice, and on the issue of sexuality, it seems that he has saying that he defends church teaching on homosexuality and also on marriage, but that he, if I'm using the term correctly, he seems to want a more of a developed pastoral theology of how do you help gay people live out church teaching and so forth. And so obviously there are more conservative voices in the church who would say, oh, we already know the answer to that is continence and so forth. So there is clearly some tension there.
Well, you know, I know that Father Timothy Radcliffe has asked the Pope, firstly, to be dispensed from being ordained a bishop, and recently it was reported that he's also asked for a dispensation of having to wear the red cassock and go out to buying all these new clothes, so that he intends, it seems, even at the consistory where he's made a cardinal, just to continue to wear the Dominican habit, which there's a tradition of that. You know, Pope Pius V continued to wear his habit as Pope. Any other new cardinal designates that we should know about?
Well, I think the cardinal designate from Australia, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, is a very interesting choice because, of course, the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Archbishop Shevchuk, who is in Ukraine, has not yet been made a cardinal, and people can speculate as to why that might be. Certainly, there's been tension with the Pope, between him and the Pope over the war in Ukraine and the Pope's approach to that. But this bishop, this soon-to-be cardinal, is very young. He's younger than 50, so he'll be around for a long time probably, and that's an unusual choice. He's also now will be the only cardinal elector, or perhaps I think the only cardinal of any kind from Australia.
The Synod is in its final week this October. There's already been 3 weeks, and these have been long days. And as we, even mentioned a little bit earlier in this broadcast, some of the delegates here are parents. They're away from their children. Can you give, for viewers who aren't aware of, what practically does the Synod on Synodality look like for these delegates? Can you give us an idea as to what these days are like for these delegates?
Well, some have noted that the days are very long, that have been for the official proceedings. And then, of course, there's the fact that you can't come to Rome for an occasion like this where there are so many big names in the church, for lack of a better way of putting it, and not have lots of meetings on the sidelines. So people are meeting up for lunch, for dinner, for coffee, for drinks, constantly. It's such an opportunity, and so I think it's been very busy for them indeed, and I'm sure that many of them are looking forward with relief to the home stretch.
So here we are at the home stretch for this week. What are you looking at, and what should our viewers keep an eye on over the next few days?
Well, I think the main job of the Synod this week will be producing the final report. And so it's a question of what will be in the final report. And as we said, decentralization has been clearly a controversial issue, even behind closed doors. So given that, again, these controversial issues like women's ordination, sexuality, potentially other things like medical ethics, like contraception, all these controversial issues that have been swirling around are in theory not to be addressed in this document. So what will be? Will decentralization, and how specific will it be? It seems unlikely that it will, there's a fool's game to make predictions, but that it will make very, very dramatic, concrete proposals, but who knows? And then the other question is, what weight will the Pope give it? As we said, he's kind of in effect extended the Synod into next year with these working groups. So, maybe eventually he will write a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. That would be the way things usually go. As we know, the Pope doesn't feel always bound by these precedents. But it could be, he could choose under canon law as he has revised it, he could choose to make this final report that should come out this coming weekend a magisterial document in itself. He might decide to do that.
Frank, you've been one of my favorite Vatican journalists for many, many years, and I know you've been covering the Vatican beat for 17 years now. We've heard. What do you think the long-term significance of this synod will be for the Church and just this whole concept of synodality? Have you given that any thought?
Well, I think there are at least two things that occur to me. One is process. I mean, this is largely about process, and in fact, that's why some people have rolled their eyes and said, oh, is it all about navel gazing? Is it all kind of bureaucratic? But, I mean, I think the Pope is setting out a kind of a model. He's setting out a model that he wants to say, look, this is the way that we should govern and at least discern and discuss, and so this should be, I think, more than by implication, this is a model for the diocese, this is a model for the Universal Church, for his successors here in Rome. So I think there's that. And I think also in terms of specific issues, I wouldn't hold my breath. I mean, remember in 2019, the Amazon Synod was abuzz with the prospect of ordaining married men and also women deacons. And in the end, the bishops at that assembly voted in favor of ordaining married men, and even a simple majority voted in favor of ordaining women deacons, and the Pope decided to say nothing about it at all. And yet those things are in the air and remain so. And I think it's more about sort of setting the table, widening the Overton window, as people say, widening the scope, the range of topics that may be discussed. Because now people are talking about things. It's inconceivable. I think you would agree, tell me if you don't, but in 2012, before the election of Pope Francis, that we would be talking about, are same-sex blessings okay in Africa or not? I mean, it would, these things are, or contraception, I mean, these things were supposed to be settled teaching. Many would argue they still are, and yet they're being talked about. Things that many people would have said are impossible are now at least notionally possible.
Well, Frank, we are grateful for your reporting here at the Vatican and for taking the time to share your insights with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll keep talking to you, I'm sure. But stay with us. Our coverage on the Synod on Synodality continues right after this break.
I think every single person is called by God with a purpose. And so the question then becomes, how do we live out our purpose? The mission of the Lila Rose Show is to bring people together where we can discover how can we live the most beautiful and fulfilling lives, how to have the healthiest relationships, how to discover wellness, and then go on a deeper journey in our faith to draw closer to God so that we're able to, together, live lives that are flourishing.
The EWTN home video highlight for October is Wolves in the Fold. Explore the turbulent waters of modern philosophy to see how Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud galvanized popular opinion with radical ideas that challenged church teaching.
Marxism has given the church a blow. It absolutely has. It's caused us to question our heroes, our institutions, our government, and our churches. And if you look at a lot of mainstream Protestant churches, some of them are in free fall.
Leading with a positive vision of what a good life is. And the Catholic Church has everything within her to present a positive vision. Marxist ideology can only break things down. And the Catholic Church, at its very core, is a life-giving institution.
Order your DVD at EWTNRC.com, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or call 1-800-854-6316.
Hello, Journey Home family. Next time, we'll welcome Dr. Kent Hill, a former Nazarene, to share but led him home to the Catholic Church. Share the journey next time on EWTN's The Journey Home.
Welcome back to our ongoing coverage of the Synod on Synodality in Rome. So again, this is our first day here on the last week of the Synod on Synodality. We'll be here all week. What are you both keeping your eyes on? What are you looking out for?
Well, first, I want to echo what Frank Rocca said, and I'm kind of glad that we weren't here for a full 3 or 4 weeks. I mean, this really is practically a difficult thing for especially families to do. I'll be looking for just what we were talking about. How are these two sides of the drama? The side that wants change and wants more internal reflection, or the side that sees evangelization, sees the conversion of the world, the new evangelization of the faithful who have left the church, how this sort of shakes out in the final document. And of course, I would be lying or remiss if I didn't say I was also concerned. I'm a little concerned just about all of those side conversations that we all know is going on this week in various trattorias and restaurants throughout the city.
The unstructured, informal ones.
The informal ones, yes. Usually over a very good meal. Rome has
here especially
superb food. Yeah, I think there's also a tendency because of the media, and it's true in life too, of looking for winners and losers. And I think that's something that we need to avoid too.
Yeah.
This is a synod. This is a synod of bishops. It is a consultative body, and they are going to be rendering advice to the Pope. Now, how we get there seems to have been filled at times with some contentious discussions. But that's what Pope Francis wants. We have seen that as a major characteristic of almost every synod of his pontificate. We go all the way back to 2014-15 with the synods on the family that led to Amoris Laetitia, with more discussion about the question, for example, of communion for the divorced and remarried without an annulment. Can they receive communion? So he likes this process of everyone being given a chance to talk, to be heard. At the end of the day, though, as we saw, we were just talking about the Amazonian Synod, he's the one who makes that decision. And his post-apostolic exhortation, Querida Amazonia, which was a reflection on the Amazonian Synod, looked very different from what many people in this synod wanted to have him implement.
And again, on some of these quote-unquote hot-button issues, and we should avoid sensationalizing a lot of what is happening here in Rome, Pope Francis has been clear time and time again on his stance on that. But again, we're watching everything closely. Is there a big difference between the group of synod delegates who were here last October compared to this October?
No, actually, it's largely the same group. The announcement was made at the end of last year's synod that essentially everyone was invited to come back. Now, the difference really comes down to a fairly small group, about 25 people. Some simply have not been able to attend. Others have chosen not to attend. And in most cases, they have been replaced by other delegates. For example, Cardinal Timothy Dolan is not present. He's in many ways represented, or the USCCB is represented by Archbishop William Laurie of Baltimore, who's also the vice president of the USCCB. So there are people who are filling in, but for the most part, this is the same group. Now, what's interesting, and I know this is something we're going to want to talk a lot more about this week, are the theological forums that were held that often involved theologians and canonists or canon lawyers who are not actual participants but have been invited to speak.
And can you explain that a little bit more? So these are these theological forums happening here in Rome. parallel to the Synod on Synodality?
Well, that's right, largely sponsored by the Synod in order to advance sort of the theological discussions and reflections on the major topics. So as you can imagine, a great deal of focus on these forums has been on the relationship of bishops, the authority of bishops, the relationship of local churches to the universal church, what exactly is primacy in the life of the church, what is the role of lay people. So many of the very themes that they're tackling in terms of authority and the role of Episcopal conferences have all been addressed at these theological forums. Some of the participants are participants also of the Synod. Others are theological and canonical experts that they brought in to do their reflections. We've done some very significant reporting on this, certainly at the National Catholic Register and the Catholic News Agency on these. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at those.
Well, you know, on that point, I think it's also important for our viewers to note that not everything that the Church has taught universally has been solemnized as dogmatic doctrine, right? In fact, there's obviously a handful, more than a handful of dogmatic doctrines, but a lot of what the Church believes about, say, the relationship between the universal church and the local church has been an issue for at least 100 and some years now of theological debate and theological discussion. I mean, famously in the 80s and 90s between Walter Casper and Joseph Ratzinger.
That was moderated by the late Cardinal Avery Dulles.
And moderated by the late Cardinal Avery Dulles. So it's important to note that there are different ways to think about some of these questions. I would simply note, however, that even if something is not yet a dogmatically defined doctrine, there are doctrines that are so necessary for the dogmas, for what the Church believes and how the Church lives, that kind of messing with them or adjusting them can actually have real repercussions.
Right, and we were talking about repercussions of things. So unraveling, for example, or decentralizing the church, granting excessive powers to Episcopal conferences in the areas of doctrine and morals, for example, that leads us down a road. Now, the road of concern for many people is that this takes us straight down the path to the Anglican Communion, for example, which is fractured. We're seeing that the risk, too, of looking more like the Methodists or the Presbyterians, who themselves have been shattered in terms of their own unity on the major question of homosexuality and human sexuality. So there are reasons why a lot of people are concerned about the implications for some of these decisions.
Which we're closely monitoring and following as we discuss what we're looking out for this week. Frank made an interesting point that with the development of these study groups that Pope Francis has commissioned, it essentially extends the Synod on Synodality another year, because these study groups, I believe, continue through Rome, or through June.
At least June of next year.
Through June. Speak to the significance of that, and again, the Synod continuing.
Right. Well, that's going to be one of those open questions at the end of this week. One is, what will Pope Francis do with this final report? Because there will be one. They're going to vote on one. As we've been discussing, as Frank talked about, is the Pope going to accept it and just simply attach his signature so it has a certain magisterial weight? Is he going to develop an apostolic exhortation out of it, which is typical for this? Or is he going to wait? Is he going to let this sit until he has these final reports from all of these 10 study groups? As you say, it takes us into June of next year. It's also possible he could extend it further for additional study. And a question that's worth sort of putting on the table right now is, there is a tradition, it's typical, to announce the topic of the next synod. We're still trying to get through this one, so I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But it is very common to announce the topic of the next one because it requires years of study and preparation. Is Francis going to announce what the topic will be for the next synod?
And again, putting this into context, I want to get to your point as well, Father. Pope Francis, there's been quite a number of synods under the Pope Francis pontificate, more so than other modern popes.
It seems that way. I mean, the Second Vatican Council did speak about the possibility of synods, and it was implemented by Pope St. John Paul II early on. But under his pontificate, I mean, it seems like, you probably know this better than me, Matthew, but it seems like it was almost every 4 or 5 years. It was much more rare under John Paul's pontificate.
Well, for note, this is the 16th Ordinary Assembly of the Synod of Bishops. So we've had 16 of them since the founding, and this goes all the way back to Pope St. Paul VI, who at the very end of the Second Vatican Council decided to establish this as an ongoing way for the bishops of the world to gather not in an ecumenical council, but as a way to advise the Pope on the pressing issues of the time. Then we have also these sort of extraordinary synods, and then we have the regional ones. We had the regional one, for example, in Amazonia. So there have been quite a few. Pope Francis has essentially placed greater focus on the synods because he sees this as more of an instrument of his vision for the church in a way I think you can argue that John Paul II didn't, or certainly Pope Benedict didn't. He saw them, I think, he sees synods, Pope Francis does, as an instrument for advancing his vision, as I was saying. In this case, synodality, which is now one of the major projects of this pontificate, is his, I think, lasting legacy, or wants it to be.
And our final moments together on this first day here together, closing thoughts as we enter into this week.
Well, I'm really thrilled to be back here in Rome with you two. You know, we're all great friends, and it's always a great experience to be here in Rome. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the final document looks like. It does sound, I think Frank is right, that it does sound like this synod is a little bit less heated. The temperature has been turned way down because of these study groups. And so I don't expect we'll see a lot of political machinations, but if we do, that will be fascinating to follow.
We'll be here to report on it,
Yeah, I think it's worth suggesting that everyone go to ncregister.com or Catholic News Agency for two reasons. One, to follow our coverage, but also we have articles on adopt a synod participant. Keep them in prayer. It's not too late to adopt them. And that, I think, is an important closing word for all of us, to keep this synod in our prayers, the participants in our prayers, but above all, Pope Francis in our prayers.
In our church, in our prayers. Well, that's a great note to leave it on this first day together. That does conclude our broadcast coverage today. We'll be here all week, so make sure to continue to tune in. And as Matthew mentioned, make sure to go to CatholicNewsAgency.com for live updates of the Synod on Synodality. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless.
America stands at a tipping point in the ongoing battle to protect the dignity of all human life. Whether on television, radio, print, or online, EWTN News brings insight and analysis